Hi everyone, I'm Noah Bassel from the Hebrew University, and I'll start our talk called Here in Hebrew Pharyngeals, Experimental Evidence for a Covert Phonemic Distinction. We'll focus on a consonant merger in modern Hebrew between the pharyngeal fricative ha and the velar fricative cha. This distinction is mainly related with speakers of Middle Eastern and North African origin. The cover term for this in Hebrew is Mizrahi, literally meaning Oriental. Let's hear the distinction in a minimal pair. First, the pharyngeal.
Mahar.
Velar.
Mahar.
The first word means tomorrow in Hebrew. The second word means to sell in past tense. And when we look into speakers of European origin, what is known as Ashkenazi, the two words are pronounced the same. We know from previous studies that usually speakers who have a merger in their production also find it harder to discriminate between the sound in perception. Interestingly, in Hebrew, we find that this is not the case. That is, speakers of merged dialects perform quite well in classification tasks, and actually they are almost on a par with the non-merged speakers. The main things we want to argue today is first that merged speakers can perceive a certain distinction between sounds and yet not represent them as separate categories in their lexicon. That other merged speakers that were exposed to the distinction during acquisition maintain distinct categorical representations. And finally, that markers of ethnic identity may be salient at the indexical level and still not be represented lexically. The talk will proceed as follows. I'll start with introducing the variables, continue with presenting the lexical decision task where we switch the two sounds with each other, and then conclude with a discussion. Starting with the phonological inventory of modern Hebrew, this is the distinct inventory. We can see two pharyngeal consonants, including ha. These two sounds are merged in currently most variants of modern Hebrew, and for convenience, we'll call them by their orthographic labels, the graphemes in the writing system. So the pharyngeal will be called chet, and the velar fricative will be called chaf. The merger triggers a few levels of opacity. First of all, in the writing system, as we said, there are two graphemes representing the two distinct sounds. This means that for merged dialects, which obviously use the same writing system, there are two graphemes representing the same sound, which is rather confusing. But the opacity doesn't stop there, and that is because chaf is actually an allophone of the stop k, and we know that, among other things, based on alternations in the verbal system. There's an spirantization rule in Hebrew which turns stops into fricatives in certain positions in the verb. So for example, a verb like kitev, corresponded in past tense, turns to yechatev in the future tense, and that does not happen for the pharyngeal. In the case of the pharyngeal, chipes remains yechapes in future tense, and that means that for merged dialects, there's one sound, chaf, which alternates with certain verbs and not in others. So for merged speakers, this alternation seems on the surface unmotivated. We looked into three groups of speakers. So first of all, the merged group versus the non-merged group. We know that non-merged speakers receive non-merged inputs and they produce non-merged input as well. Merged group receive merged input and produce merged categories. And then a third group is of second generation Mizrahi speakers who have merged production like their Ashkenazi peers, but we know received the non-merged input from their parents. And basically what we're asking is, what is the categorical distinction in their lexicon? And we expect them to be more like their parents than like their peers, although they sound the same. To state the research question, we are asking, is there a difference in the status of chet across merged speakers in accordance with the variant of Hebrew that they were exposed to during acquisition? And the method is exposing speakers of different backgrounds to manipulated words where the sounds chet and chaf were switched. we asked the speakers with a non-merged production to record common Hebrew words and switch the sounds chet and chaf with each other. So, for example, a word like achot, sister, with chet was pronounced as achot with chaf. The result in this case is a familiar word because most Hebrew speakers now pronounce this word this way, but it's inconsistent with the speaker that uses pharyngeals otherwise. So we call this the inconsistent condition. Then words like mechonit, which are originally produced with chaf, were now produced with chet, mechonit. We call this the pathological condition because this kind of input is not attested in any variant of Hebrew. 3 groups participated in the experiment. Out of the 2 merged groups, there was 1 group where there was at least 1 parent pronouncing chet, and then another group where there were no family members pronouncing this sound. The experiment included 3 blocks with pauses between them. The first one was an Ashkenazi block where the categories were merged. Then 2 blocks with a Mizrahi speaker who makes the distinction between the categories. The first one is a regular input, and the last and critical block, which was twice as long, included both regular input with the pharyngeal distinction and manipulated input where chet was replaced with chaf and vice versa. So a bit of an example how it sounds. Words who originate with chet, like achot, sounded like that in the merge block.
Achot.
This is the pharyngeal version with chet.
Achot.
And then the manipulated version.
Achot.
Sounds like the first one because we switched between chet and chaf. Now words originating with chaf.
Mechonit.
Sounds the same in the
Mechonet.
Mizrahi condition, and then in the pathological condition, we have
Mechonet.
the predictions were as follows. We expected words with no chet and no chaf to be processed the same by all speakers. Same goes for words with chaf and for words with chet. In the inconsistent condition, we didn't expect Ashkenazi speakers to be bothered by the manipulation, but we're not sure what the both groups of Mizrahi speakers would think, because again, this input is familiar, but it's inconsistent with the recorded speaker, which makes a distinction between chet and chaf. And finally, in the pathological condition, we expected Mizrahi speakers who are non-merged in their production to reject these words. We expected the second generation Mizrahi speakers to reject them as well. And we expected the Ashkenazi speakers again to accept these words, because if they interpret the chet sound as a social marker and not as a phoneme, they should not have a problem mapping it back to the chaf sound and reaching the correct Hebrew word, mechonit.
Hi, I'm C, and I'm going to take it from here. The graph we'll now see is a summary of the acceptance rates model. Let's break it down a bit. So our groups of participants are merged speakers in red, of European descent. Then we have the Mizrahi non-merged speakers in blue, and in between in green, the second generation Mizrahi listeners. On the left panel, we have the merged speaker's voice. So items produced by this voice include a baseline condition in which none of the target sounds is included. So this is words like trufa. Then we have the etymologically chaf words in which in both dialects we get the same item. So this is mechonit. And then we have the merged categories. So in this speaker's voice, it was produced as chaf, although it's etymologically het, as you can see in the corresponding condition in the pharyngealizing speaker's voice. In addition to these 3 conditions, in the pharyngealizing speaker's voice, we also have the switched category conditions. One is the inconsistent condition. So this is the correct direction of the merger. This production is identical, in fact, in terms of variance to the merged speaker's production, but it is inconsistent with the identity of a pharyngealizing speaker. And then we have the other direction of the merger. So etymologically, chaf words becoming het. So words like mechonit that are predicted to be not valid lexically. For items produced by the merged speaker's voice, there was no significant difference between the groups, as we expected. When we consider the pharyngealizing speaker's voice, there's a significant difference in how these three groups react to the pathological condition. Pharyngealizing speakers almost never accept words like mechonit, while most merged speakers do. The group of passive Mizrahi listeners is somewhere in between, probably closer to the European heritage speakers, the merged speakers, than to the generation of their parents. The pathological condition got lower acceptance rates in all groups, but there were significant interactions with participant group such that pharyngealizers and pharyngeal listeners accepted these items much less often. The pharyngealizing speakers, so the Mizrahi speakers, had also punished the pharyngealizing speaker for being inconsistent. So if we compare the item achot across the two speakers' voices, we can see that when a merged speaker produces an etymological het as chaf, it's okay. But when the same is done by the pharyngealizing speaker, it gets punished. So this interaction was only evident in the Mizrahi group and not in the passive Mizrahi group. Moving on to the reaction times analysis, we had a linear regression model that included basically only correct trials, but we also added items from the inconsistent and pathological conditions, even if they were responded to with rejection. This is because these items are anyway ambiguous, and the reaction times can help us better interpret the overall effect of them. Starting with the merged speaker's voice. So items that included either of the target sounds, het or chaf, got longer reaction times. This was true not only for the merged voice, it was actually a main effect that is true for both voices, and we think it's probably because of the overall high rate of words that include these two sounds in the experiment. So including the non-words, 2/3 of all stimuli included either het or chaf, and we attribute the difference in reaction times to this general carefulness with these type of items, since a lot of the time they turned out to be non-words. There was no interaction for this effect with participant group. Looking at the reaction times for the pharyngealizing speaker, we know that for the pathological condition, all three groups responded to more slowly. However, there was also a significant interaction with participant group. Well, two significant interactions. So reaction times were much longer for both pharyngealizers and pharyngeal listeners. Moving on to the inconsistent condition, there was no main effect, but only interactions between a condition and participant voice. So participant group, sorry. Both the Mizrahi group and the passive Mizrahi group responded to these items more slowly when they were produced in the pharyngealizing speaker's voice. So this is actually mimicking the effect we saw in the acceptance rates model only for pharyngealizers, but here it's evident both for the pharyngealizers, for the Mizrahi group, and for their second generation group. And note again that for the same items, exactly in terms of the variant used, no such interaction was found for the merged speaker's voice. So this is really the effect of having an inconsistent speaker. So we've seen that speakers who on the surface speak the same dialect may still show different behaviors based on their parents' dialect. Speakers of the same spoken dialect differed in their behavior on pathological items. So the passive Mizrahi group and the merged speakers group had significant differences in acceptance rates of the pathological items as well in their reaction times, indicating that they have different lexical representations. For inconsistent items, these groups also significantly differed in reaction times, indicating that there's some sensitivity to the speaker's identity that we could only see for the passive Mizrahi listeners who are much more proficient in the Mizrahi dialect. So speakers may share the same production despite having different grammars, basically. For our merged speakers, recall that they are very good at phonetically distinguishing between these two categories. But when we see the lexical task, het and chaf seem to be at some level equivalent. This indicates that the issue they have with these items is a lexical encoding issue. So het and chaf are not encoded in the lexicon as separate categories. Merged speakers notice het, but they don't register it, at least not in a lexical level. This can be explained within a dual root model of speech perception. These kind of models have emerged in recent years that suggest that processing of speech has to proceed in at least two different routes. This solves some problems of sense making. For example, looking at a word like bonnet, which would have different meanings in British and American English, Kai and colleagues showed that when bonnet is produced with a British accent, it's being disambiguated as a hood of a car, while when it's produced by an American accent, it's disambiguated to be a sort of hat. So how does it happen? Well, when we process in the indexical or social route, we understand, well, the speaker is British, so probably we should access the British meaning, thus disambiguating the lexical meaning. How is it relevant for our case? So it seems that some cues may be relevant to social evaluation and still not enter the lexicon. So basically, systematic variation can be interpreted lexically or indexically. What we claim is that for merged listeners, het is only interpreted indexically. If a merged speaker hears het within speech, it will be processed simultaneously in the lexical route, in which het will immediately be treated as a sort of chaf and mapped into the correct representation in cases in which chaf should be there, but also mapped incorrectly into chaf in cases in which it's not okay, like in the pathological condition. At the same time, het will be registered as a marker of Arab or Mizrahi identity and evaluated socially in accordance with that. To sum up, second generation Mizrahi listeners represent distinctions that are absent from their production. This point is intimately related with prejudice against Arab and Mizrahi identities. The fact that most second generation speakers, despite maintaining this distinction covertly, chose not to produce het was mentioned in the exit questionnaire by some of our participants. One said about her younger sister who used the pharyngeals when she was young, I made her stop. I basically saved her life. The second point, namely that acoustic data may be used socially while at the same time ignored lexically, is related to the fact that het seems to be salient, but when we don't have enough early input to support a lexical distinction, it may only be processed socially. The final point we had no real time to focus on in this short presentation, but recall that het and chaf are represented by different letters. So most literate Hebrew speakers, most of the time, didn't seem to care that the pathological forms are not consistent with the orthographic system. That is it. Thank you very much.